I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but here we are. It's been 3 months since that night, and I still replay every moment in my mind. I'm not proud of what I did, but I also don't regret it. If you've stumbled across this story, buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride. It all started on New Year's Eve. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 10 years. We had a son, Lucas, who's 9, and our life, on the surface, looked picture perfect. We hosted a big New Year's party at our house every year. Friends, family, laughter, and fireworks, it was a tradition. This year, Uncle Henry decided to join us. He's my father's younger brother, only about 12 years older than me. He's the charming type, always cracking jokes, always the center of attention. Emily always said he was fun to have around. I didn't think much of it. The night was loud and chaotic, as these parties usually are. People were scattered across the house, drinks were flowing, and music blasted through the speakers. At around 11:45 p.m., I noticed Emily wasn't around. I assumed she was in the kitchen or mingling with the guests. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. But Lucas wasn't by my side. Usually, he's clinging to me at midnight, eager to pop confetti and shout, "Happy New Year!" 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Cheers erupted, champagne glasses clinked, fireworks exploded outside. But amidst the celebration I felt off. About 10 minutes later, Lucas found me in the living room. His face was pale, his small hands trembling. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Dad, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I knelt down to his level. "What is it, buddy?" He hesitated, looking around nervously, then leaned in closer. "I saw Mom go into the guest room with Uncle Henry, and they were making noises, Dad." My heart stopped. My ears started ringing. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Surely, he was mistaken. Surely, this was some misunderstanding. But Lucas wasn't lying. His little face was etched with confusion and fear. I patted his head and forced a smile. "Thank you for telling me, Lucas. Go to your room now, okay? I'll take care of this." He nodded and scurried away. I stood up, my chest tight, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. The guest room was down the hall, on the far side of the house. I made my way there, every step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of string lights from the living room. As I approached the door, I paused. I could hear faint murmurs behind it, muffled voices. My vision blurred with anger, but I didn't burst in. No, I turned away. I needed to be smart about this. Storming in would cause a scene, and I didn't want that, yet. Instead, I walked back to the party, put on a smile, and carried on like nothing had happened. But inside, something in me had snapped. That was the moment I decided, Emily and Henry would pay. And I wouldn't just confront them. Oh no, that would be too easy. I was going to destroy them, slowly, methodically, and irreversibly. I spent the rest of the party wearing a mask. Smiling, laughing, making small talk, all while my mind was spinning like a hurricane. Every glance toward Emily felt like daggers in my chest. And Uncle Henry? Oh, he was in the middle of the room, drink in hand, telling some ridiculous story to a group of guests. Emily reappeared about 20 minutes after my conversation with Lucas. Her hair was slightly tousled, her lipstick faintly smudged. But she acted normal. Too normal. "Hey, honey," she said cheerfully, wrapping her arms around me. "Are you having fun?" I forced a smile. "Of course. You." "Absolutely." She beamed and kissed my cheek. Her touch made my skin crawl. By 2 a.m., the party had started to wind down. Guests were saying their goodbyes, some lingering for one last drink. Henry was still there, slouched on the couch, laughing with one of my cousins. Emily was in the kitchen, tidying up. I decided to confront one of them, not directly, but subtly. I walked over to Henry, drink in hand, and sat across from him. "Henry," I said casually, "you enjoy yourself tonight?" Oh yeah, he grinned, his words slightly slurred. You guys throw the best parties. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Must have been a really good night for you. His smile faltered for just a moment. Just a flicker. But it was there. What do you mean? He asked, trying to play it off. I leaned back, swirling the drink in my glass. Nothing. Just glad you had a good time. He laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. Yeah, man. Thanks. That moment told me everything I needed to know. Henry wasn't just drunk, he was nervous. When the last guest left and the house was finally quiet, Emily suggested we go to bed. I'll be up in a bit, I said. Gonna clean up a little first. She hesitated for just a second before nodding and heading upstairs. Once she was out of sight, I grabbed Henry's coat from the rack by the door and began searching the pockets. And there it was, a small, unmistakable clue. A crumpled note with Emily's handwriting. Guest room. Midnight. Don't be late. My hands clenched into fists, the paper crumpling in my grip. I knew I couldn't confront them yet. No, that would be letting them off too easily. I had to play this right. If I was going to make them regret this, I needed to stay calm. Calculated. For the next week, I started planning. Every evening after Emily and Lucas went to bed, I sat in my office, staring at that crumpled note and sketching out my plan. Emily thought everything was fine. She went about her days as if nothing had happened. She smiled, she laughed, she kissed me goodnight. And every time she did, I felt something inside me twist and snap. But I stayed quiet. I stayed kind. I stayed normal. Because when my revenge came, it would be devastating. It wouldn't just end our marriage, it would end everything for her and Henry. The following days felt like walking on broken glass. Every conversation with Emily was laced with hidden meanings. Every glance at Henry made my blood boil. But I remained calm, methodical, even. I was building a plan, and I couldn't afford a single misstep. First, I started gathering evidence. I installed a small, discreet camera in the guest room. The tiny device was tucked away in a corner behind a lamp, out of sight but with a clear view of the bed. I set it up while Emily was out shopping one afternoon. Next, I made sure Emily thought I was busy with work. I'd stay late at the office or lock myself in my study at home. I wanted her to feel safe, comfortable enough to slip back into her affair without suspicion. Then came the next move. I decided to invite Henry over for dinner the following Friday. Henry's coming over? Emily asked, her voice tight, her smile forced. Yeah, I said casually. It's been a while since we had a nice family dinner. Thought it'd be good for Lucas, too. She hesitated before nodding. Sure, that sounds nice. Oh, Emily. You're such a terrible liar. Friday came, and Henry arrived with his usual grin and a bottle of wine. Emily had cooked one of her signature dishes, chicken parmesan. It was a nice dinner, filled with fake smiles and forced laughter. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, chatted excitedly about school and video games. But I noticed the stolen glances between Emily and Henry. The little smirks. The way her hand brushed his when she passed him a plate. By the end of the meal, I could barely stomach it. Henry, you should stay over tonight, I said, keeping my voice light. We've got the guest room all set up. Henry's smile faltered for just a moment, and Emily froze mid-step as she cleared the table. Oh, I wouldn't want to impose, Henry said, trying to sound casual. Nonsense, I said, leaning back in my chair. It's late, and you've been drinking. Stay the night? Emily chimed in, her voice unusually high-pitched. Yeah, Henry. You should stay. He glanced at her, then back at me. All right. If you insist. The trap was set. That night, I stayed in the living room, pretending to watch TV while Emily said she was going to bed early. Henry retired to the guest room shortly after. But I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the live feed from the tiny camera in the guest room. And there it was. Emily entered the room about 20 minutes later, closing the door softly behind her. Henry was waiting for her, and their hushed voices crackled faintly through my speakers. I turned off the phone. I'd seen enough. I spent the rest of the night sitting in silence, my mind a storm of rage and cold calculation. When morning came, Emily greeted me in the kitchen, acting like everything was perfectly normal. Henry emerged from the guest room about an hour later, yawning and stretching. "Morning, champ," he said, flashing me a grin. I smiled back. "Morning, Henry. Sleep well?" "Like a baby," he said with a chuckle. Emily poured herself coffee, her hands shaking ever so slightly. I couldn't help but smile. Because now I had everything I needed. The evidence. The motive. The perfect plan. And when the time came, it would all come crashing down on them in the most spectacular way possible. The weight of what I'd seen on that tiny camera pressed on my chest like a boulder. But oddly enough, I felt calm. There was no chaotic rage, no impulse to scream or confront them on the spot. Instead, there was clarity, a sharp, cruel clarity that guided every decision I made from that moment forward. Over the next few days, I distanced myself just enough to make Emily notice. She started asking questions. "Is everything okay, babe? You've been distant." I'd smile and kiss her forehead. "Work stress, Em. Nothing to worry about." She'd nod, but I could see the guilt flicker in her eyes. Henry, on the other hand, was a little less perceptive. He sent me a text 2 days after that dinner. "Had a great time at your place, man. Thanks again. We should grab a drink sometime." I stared at the message for a while before replying. "Absolutely, Uncle Henry. How about Friday night?" "My treat." He agreed without hesitation. That week, I put the next phase of my plan into motion. I started subtly manipulating Emily. I'd leave my phone unlocked on purpose, with vague text messages from someone labeled SK popping up on the screen. Messages like, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." Of course, there was no SK. It was me, texting myself from a burner number. Emily noticed. I caught her glancing at my phone when she thought I wasn't looking. I'd come home late a few times, disheveled, and she'd ask where I'd been. Work ran late. Big project deadline. But her suspicion had taken root, and that's exactly what I wanted. Friday arrived, and I met Henry at a quiet bar downtown. I chose a place where the booths were dimly lit and tucked away. We clinked glasses, and he leaned back with that same casual grin he always wore. "So, how's everything, man? You've been kinda quiet lately." I sipped my whiskey and stared at him for a long moment. "You know, Henry, trust is such a fragile thing, isn't it?" His smile froze. What do you mean?" I leaned closer, keeping my voice low. "It's amazing how people can smile in your face while stabbing you in the back. Makes you wonder who you can really trust, doesn't it?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I'm not sure what you're talking about." I smirked, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Then I clapped him on the shoulder, laughing. "Relax, Henry. I'm just messing with you. Been watching too many crime dramas lately." He forced a laugh, but his face was pale, and his eyes darted around nervously. That night, I went home and found Emily in bed, staring at her phone. She didn't notice me at first. Her expression was one of pure fear. I cleared my throat, and she flinched. "Hey, babe. Couldn't sleep?" She locked her phone and forced a smile. "Yeah, just scrolling through some stuff. You're home late." "Yeah, Henry and I had a long chat. Good times, though." Her face froze for a split second before she nodded. "That's nice." I kissed her goodnight and turned over, but I didn't sleep. Both of them were now on edge, their guilt and paranoia eating away at them. Perfect. The next morning, Emily cornered me in the kitchen. Are you seeing someone else?" she blurted out. I raised an eyebrow. "What?" "No. Why would you think that?" Her voice trembled. "I've seen the texts, the late nights, the way you've been acting distant. I leaned in, my face inches from hers. Funny. I could say the exact same thing about you. Her eyes went wide, and her mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, stunned and silent. The stage was almost set. The final act was drawing near. And when the curtain fell, it would bring everything crashing down around them. Emily became a shadow of herself over the next few days. She was jittery, overly attentive, and constantly watching me out of the corner of her eye. Every interaction felt like a high-wire act. Meanwhile, Henry stopped texting altogether. I knew they were panicking, second-guessing every glance, every word, every moment. But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. One evening, while Emily was putting Lucas to bed, I pulled out 2 envelopes. Inside each one was a handwritten invitation. You're invited to an exclusive dinner this Saturday. Just the 3 of us, no distractions. Come dressed for an unforgettable night. I placed one envelope on Emily's nightstand and the other in Henry's mailbox the following morning. Emily found her invitation later that night. She came into my study holding the envelope, her hands trembling. What is this? She asked. A dinner, I said simply, not looking up from my computer. Just us, and Henry? Her voice wavered. I met her gaze and smiled. Yes. I think it's time we all had a little honesty between us, don't you think? She swallowed hard and nodded. Saturday arrived like the slow ticking of a bomb. I spent the day preparing the dining room. A fine tablecloth, polished silverware, and our best wine, everything was set for a perfect evening. Lucas was staying the night at a friend's house, which Emily didn't question. At 7 p.m. sharp, Emily walked into the dining room wearing a long emerald dress. Her makeup was flawless, but I could see the strain in her eyes. Everything looks beautiful, she said softly. Thank you. Have a seat. At 7:10 p.m., Henry arrived. He looked far less composed. His collar was crooked, his tie uneven. He avoided my eyes as he stepped inside. Good evening, Henry. Right on time, I said with a smile. The 3 of us sat down at the table. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware against porcelain. I poured wine into each of our glasses, letting the deep red liquid swirl in the light. To family, I said, raising my glass. Emily hesitated before clinking her glass against mine, and Henry followed suit. After a few bites of food, I leaned back in my chair and looked at both of them. You know, I've been thinking a lot about trust lately. Emily froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Henry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Trust, I continued, is such a fragile thing, isn't it? It takes years to build and just one moment to shatter completely. No one spoke. Emily, Henry, do you trust me? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and Henry cleared his throat. Of course we do, Henry said, his voice cracking. Good, I said, standing up. Because tonight I have something very special planned. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up my laptop. I set it on the table, turned it around, and pressed play on the video I had recorded from the hidden camera in the guest room. The color drained from Emily's face. Henry's mouth fell open. There was no sound except for the faint hum of the laptop speakers and their heavy breathing. When the video ended, I closed the laptop and folded my arms. Do you have anything to say? I asked quietly. Emily burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Henry's head hung low, staring at the tablecloth. Emily started, but her voice broke. No, I interrupted. I don't want excuses. I don't want apologies. I want you both to sit there and understand exactly what you've done. Henry finally spoke, his voice shaking. Please, it was a mistake, we didn't mean. I slammed my hand on the table, and both of them jumped. Don't. Just don't. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. After a long pause, I sighed and sat back down. You know, I said softly, I thought about exposing you both publicly. Sending this video to everyone we know. But that's too easy. Too quick. Emily sobbed quietly into her hands. Henry stared down, unable to meet my eyes. I want you both to understand something, I continued. Everything you've built, everything you care about, it's already gone. You just don't know it yet. I stood up and walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting there in their misery. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After that dinner, the house was suffocating with silence. Emily tried to talk to me multiple times, but I shut her down with cold, sharp replies. Henry stopped coming around altogether. They were both trapped in the web I had woven, and I wasn't done pulling the strings. But the true revenge? That was just beginning. The next morning, Emily approached me cautiously while I was drinking my coffee at the kitchen table. Please talk to me, she whispered. I set my mug down and looked her dead in the eyes. Talk to you? About what, Emily? About how you threw away our marriage for him? Or about how you lied to my face for months? Which conversation are you hoping for? She broke down into tears again, but I felt nothing. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake. Mistakes happen once, Emily. What you did was a choice. Over and over again. I stood up and walked away, leaving her sobbing in the kitchen. But while Emily was wallowing in her guilt, I was busy with the next phase of my plan. I called Henry's wife, my Aunt Linda. Henry had always been a smooth talker, and Aunt Linda was a sweet, kind woman who didn't deserve this betrayal. Hey, Linda, I said, my voice steady. I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow morning? She sounded confused but agreed. The next morning, I met Aunt Linda at a quiet cafe downtown. She smiled warmly at me, but I could tell she sensed something was off. What's wrong, dear? She asked. I took a deep breath and slid a USB drive across the table. Before I say anything, I need you to watch what's on this. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she picked it up. What is this? It's the truth, I said simply. I didn't stay to see her reaction. I paid for her coffee and left her there, clutching the USB drive like it was a ticking bomb. 2 days later, chaos erupted. Henry's marriage imploded spectacularly. Aunt Linda threw him out of the house, and word of the affair started trickling through the family. Emily was spiraling. She'd been calling Henry repeatedly, but he wasn't answering. Why is he ignoring me? She muttered one night as she scrolled through her phone. I looked at her calmly from across the room. Maybe because he has bigger problems now. You know, like losing his wife, his home, and probably most of his savings in the divorce. Emily froze, her face pale. You told her, didn't you? I sipped my whiskey. I did more than that, Em. I gave her proof. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the floor. But why? Why would you do this? Why? I said, my voice rising slightly. Because you too didn't just betray me. You humiliated me. You turned my home into your playground. You thought I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't fight back? No, Emily. You chose this. Now you'll live with the consequences. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. But I wasn't done yet. Emily had no idea about our joint accounts. Over the last few weeks, I'd been slowly transferring our savings into an account she couldn't access. I'd also spoken to a lawyer and initiated divorce proceedings. When I handed her the divorce papers a week later, she stared at them in disbelief. You're divorcing me? I nodded. Of course, Emily. Did you think I'd just forgive this? But Lucas. Oh, don't you dare bring our son into this, I said coldly. Lucas will be fine. He'll have a stable parent who doesn't lie, cheat, or sneak around behind closed doors. She broke down completely, clutching the papers to her chest. But the final twist of the knife was still coming. I created an anonymous email account and sent the video evidence to a few select family members and mutual friends. I didn't blast it to everyone, I was selective. Just enough people to ensure that the truth would spread naturally. Emily's phone started blowing up with messages. Friends. Family. Her parents. Everyone was finding out. The weight of public shame crushed her completely. I could hear her crying late at night in the guest room, the same room where she'd betrayed me. Poetic, isn't it? But I wasn't satisfied yet. The final act was still to come. Emily was unraveling. Every day she seemed smaller, more fragile, like a cracked porcelain doll barely holding herself together. She avoided my eyes, barely spoke, and spent hours locked in the guest room, the same room where her betrayal had unfolded. Henry? He was a ghost. Word had spread through the family, and his reputation was in ruins. Aunt Linda had kicked him out, and from what I'd heard, he was sleeping on a friend's couch. But none of that brought me satisfaction. Not yet. Because there was one final string left to pull. Our son Lucas's birthday was approaching. Emily suggested a small party at home, just us and a few close family members. I agreed. The guest list was carefully curated. My parents, Aunt Linda, who now despised Henry with every fiber of her being, and a few close family friends. Henry, of course, was not invited. The day of the party arrived. Emily tried to smile, tried to put on the mask of a loving mother and devoted wife, but her eyes were hollow. Lucas was excited, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. During the party, Emily pulled me aside into the kitchen. "Thank you for letting me still be part of this," she said softly. I stared at her unblinking. "You're still his mother, Emily. But let's not pretend we're still a family." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. The party went smoothly, for a while. But then, right as we were about to cut the cake, I stood up and tapped my glass with a spoon. "Everyone, can I have your attention for a moment?" The chatter died down, and all eyes turned to me. Emily froze, her hand trembling as she held the cake knife. "I just wanted to say how much I love my son, Lucas. He's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'm grateful to everyone here who's been part of his life." There were polite nods and smiles. "But there's something else I need to address," I continued, my voice steady and sharp. Emily's eyes widened in horror. "You see, trust is one of the most important things in a family. Without it, everything falls apart. Isn't that right, Emily?" She shook her head subtly, mouthing, "Please, no." But I wasn't stopping. "I found out recently that trust in my marriage was shattered. Emily, my loving wife, and Henry, my uncle, decided that their desires were more important than their vows, or our family." The room went dead silent. My mother gasped audibly. Aunt Linda's face twisted in disgust. Emily dropped the cake knife, and it clattered loudly against the table. "David, please, not here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I continued. "I've tried to keep things private. I've tried to handle this with dignity. But you know what? They didn't deserve my silence." I turned to Lucas, who was watching with wide, confused eyes. I softened my voice. "Lucas, buddy, none of this is your fault. You're the best thing to ever happen to me, and I'll always be here for you." He nodded slowly, his little face etched with confusion. Emily sank to her knees beside the table, sobbing uncontrollably. The party ended abruptly. Guests shuffled out in uncomfortable silence, avoiding Emily's gaze. Aunt Linda walked up to her before leaving and said only 2 words. "You're disgusting." When everyone was gone, the house felt cavernous and cold. Emily was still on the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood over her, my voice low and cold. "Do you understand now, Emily? Do you see what you've done? This wasn't just about you and Henry. You've destroyed everything." She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "Please stop. I can't." But I wasn't listening anymore. I turned and walked away, leaving her crumpled on the floor like the broken person she had become. But there was still one final act left in this twisted play. The curtain hadn't fallen just yet. The aftermath of Lucas's birthday party hung over the house like a storm cloud. Emily stayed mostly in the guest room, the same place where her betrayal had begun. She barely ate, barely spoke, and avoided me at all costs. But this silence wasn't peace, it was the eye of the hurricane. I had one final card to play, and I was going to make sure it hit harder than anything else I'd done so far. I spent an evening drafting a letter. Every word was chosen carefully, every sentence a dagger designed to pierce whatever was left of Emily's spirit. The next morning, I left it on her nightstand. When I returned home from work, Emily was waiting for me in the living room, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. You can't do this," she whispered. "I already have," I said calmly. The letter had been a notification. I was selling the house. The very walls where her affair had played out would no longer belong to either of us. We had 30 days to vacate. I can't lose this house," she said, her voice breaking. "Lucas, this is his home." "No, Emily," I said firmly. "This stopped being a home the moment you invited him into our guest room." She crumbled into the couch, the letter slipping from her hands. I walked away, but not before saying, "Start packing, Emily." 30 days. The divorce proceedings began shortly after. I had gathered every shred of evidence, the footage, the texts, the financial records, and handed them to my lawyer. Emily tried to fight. She tried to paint herself as a victim, claiming it was a mistake, that she was lonely, that I had been distant. But evidence doesn't lie. The court ruled in my favor. I got primary custody of Lucas. Emily was granted visitation rights, weekends supervised at first. The house sale was finalized shortly after. The money went into an account under my name, with strict terms to ensure Lucas would always have what he needed. Emily? She walked away with barely enough to start over. Henry, on the other hand, had disappeared. Last I heard, he was living in a dingy motel on the edge of town. Aunt Linda had filed for divorce and had taken nearly everything. The two of them had burned their entire lives down for a fleeting moment behind closed doors. Poetic, isn't it? On the day Emily was scheduled to leave the house for good, she asked me for one final conversation. We sat in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes and echoes of what used to be a home. "David, do you think you'll ever forgive me?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, the woman I had once loved so deeply, and felt nothing. "No, Emily. I won't." Tears streamed down her face, but I continued. "But I'll move on. I'll rebuild my life, and I'll make sure Lucas has the best possible future. You'll have to live with what you've done." She nodded, biting her lip to keep from breaking down completely. As she picked up her suitcase and walked to the door, she turned back one last time. "Goodbye, David. Goodbye, Emily." And just like that, she was gone. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in months, the house felt quiet. Peaceful. But there was no joy in revenge. No satisfaction in watching her fall apart. Just emptiness. I walked into Lucas's room and sat on the edge of his bed. He was asleep, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. I promised myself then and there, I would focus on him. I would be the best father I could be. Emily and Henry had already sentenced themselves to a lifetime of regret. I didn't need to punish them anymore. The curtain was finally falling. But one final twist remained. The weeks following Emily's departure felt hollow but peaceful. The house, though mostly empty now, was no longer poisoned by her presence. Lucas and I were slowly settling into our new routine. But fate, it seems, had one more card to play. It was a Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "David," came a familiar, shaky voice. It was Henry. For a moment, I considered hanging up. But curiosity, or perhaps some final shred of unfinished business, kept me on the line. "What do you want, Henry?" I said coldly. I need to see you. Please. Just one meeting. Face to face. Why would I ever want to see you again? Because there's something you don't know. Something about Emily." His voice was desperate, broken. Against every instinct I had, I agreed to meet him. We met at a rundown diner on the edge of town. Henry looked terrible, his hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in them for days. He fidgeted with his coffee cup, avoiding eye contact. "Get to the point, Henry," I said flatly. He took a deep breath and finally looked up at me. "Emily wasn't the one who started it. It was me." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I pursued her. I pressured her. She was vulnerable, David. Lonely. And I took advantage of that. I slammed my hand on the table, causing a few nearby customers to glance over. "Don't you dare try to paint yourself as noble. You both made your choices. You both destroyed everything." "I know," Henry said desperately. "I know. But there's something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "What is that?" I asked. "It's a letter Emily wrote. After the affair came out. She asked me to give it to you, but I couldn't. I was too ashamed." I snatched the envelope from his hand, my heart pounding. "Read it," Henry said softly. Without another word, I stood up and left him sitting there, slumped over the table. Back home, after putting Lucas to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Emily's handwriting stared back at me, shaky and uneven. "David, if you're reading this, it means Henry finally found the courage to give it to you. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But there's something I need you to know. It wasn't just about Henry. It wasn't just about loneliness. I've been sick for a long time. I didn't know how to tell you, and I was scared. Scared of losing you, scared of what you'd think of me. I made the wrong choice. I can't take it back, but please, please believe me when I say I never stopped loving you. By the time you read this, I might not even be here anymore. I've been thinking about ending things. I don't know if I can live with what I've done. Please take care of Lucas. He deserves better than me. I'm so sorry. Emily." The paper trembled in my hands as I finished reading. Sick? What was she talking about? Suddenly, a weight settled in my chest. I grabbed my phone and called Emily. No answer. I called again. And again. Nothing. I drove to the small apartment she'd been staying in. The lights were off, the windows dark. My stomach tightened as I knocked on the door. No answer. I forced the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was cold, lifeless. In the corner of the living room, on a small side table, sat an empty pill bottle and a note. The note simply said, "I'm sorry." My breath caught in my throat as I rushed into the bedroom. Emily was lying on the bed, pale and still. But she was breathing, faintly. I called an ambulance, my voice trembling as I gave them the address. Hours later, I was sitting in the sterile waiting room of the hospital. Emily had survived, but just barely. A doctor approached me, his expression serious. "Are you her husband?" I nodded. "Ex-husband, technically. She's stable, but we discovered something during her evaluation," he said carefully. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated. "Your wife, she's been struggling with severe depression. But beyond that, we found signs of early-stage cancer. She likely knew about it but didn't tell anyone." The world tilted around me. Cancer. She knew. And she had been dealing with it alone. Suddenly, the affair, the anger, the revenge, it all felt hollow. When I finally saw Emily, she was lying in her hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IVs. She opened her eyes weakly and whispered, "David." I sat beside her, holding her frail hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly. I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of being a burden. Scared of losing you." We sat in silence for a long time. In that moment, I realized something. Revenge had consumed me, but it hadn't healed me. Emily had made terrible choices, yes. But she was still human. Flawed, broken, and now dying. When I left the hospital that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Regret. But it was too late to change the past. The final act was upon us, and the curtain was ready to fall.